Hello, learners, and welcome to the 30th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I introduced the life and briefly talked about the importance of one poetry collection by the poet Robert Lowell. The collection which I have been discussing is titled Life Studies, and it was published in the year 1959. It produced a kind of sea change in the history of American Anglophone poetry. One of the important things it did is it inspired later poets to write in a confessional, autobiographical style. But it's important to understand the context in which Life Studies was written and received in order to know why it ended up having such a lasting impact on American poetry. Life Studies was very different from both Lowell's own earlier work and most of the verse being written in English by anyone else. It had an enormous influence on the future of poetry in the United States. Life Studies is a product of the 1950s. This was a collection that rode on the shoulders of a poetic revolution that was underway as the authority of the modernist generation and of that most influenced by new criticism began to decline. What does it mean? This means that as poets like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, novelists like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, these were the part of the first wave of the avant-garde modernist literature. As these writers began to move away from the center stage of literary production, that is, as they grew older or as their work began to lose the newness as time passed, as people grew more and more accustomed to the kinds of difficulties, innovations of poems like The Wasteland, for instance, the authority of the first modernist generation began to reduce. And while this was happening, another critical movement called New Criticism, which developed as a way of paying attention to the intricacies of language, that movement also began to decline. So what happened in the 50s? A new way of reading poetry began to grow in popularity. What was that way? It was a way of reading poetry which paid at least as much attention to the theme, the life, the content, as it did to the words, the form, and the shape of the poems. Life Studies, the volume, by itself did not initiate this revolution in taste, which led to the so-called confessional movement and to postmodern poetics eventually. It was the middle of the 1950s that had marked the beginning of that change, and certainly the work of Allen Ginsberg with Howl and Other Poems, 1956, Charles Olson, The Kingfishers, 1950, and W.D. Snodgrass with the collection Heart's Needle, 1959. These poems and these poets and these collections of poetry did much to change the prevailing poetic climate. Along with those writers, there were also other crucial factors. These include the growing acceptance of the work of a poet named William Carlos Williams during the 1950s. William Carlos Williams was seen as too obscure, too niche earlier, but he began to enjoy a growing sense of acceptance in the 50s. The work of Walt Whitman, who's today considered an American sage, one of the fathers of American poetry, without whom American poetry is difficult to imagine or something. Walt Whitman began to enjoy a renewed acceptance. And this was because the new critics began to lose some of their critical relevance. So if the new critics were still had their way, then T.S. Eliot and the style in which T.S. Eliot, those kinds of poems would continue to be popular. However, as new criticism began to fade, poetry that was less concerned with form, poetry that was more concerned with meaning, with content began to grow in popularity. Uh, this was instanced by the growing popularity of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, and also the 1955 publication of an edition of Emily Dickinson's work edited by Thomas Johnson, which also put the emphasis on Dickinson's life and not so much on the words, the punctuation, the shape, structure, and form of her poems. So this was what was happening in the literary culture of the 1950s. In the social, economic, and political culture of the 1960s, also many changes were taking place. The novelist Norman Mailer has called the 1950s the worst decade in the history of man. Of course, Mailer was exaggerating, but what he's referring to is how this decade was a highly anti intellectual decade. It was a time when American life seemed to demand more conformity than ever before, perhaps as a reaction against the loosening of social roles during the Second World War. This was the decade characterized by the buildup of nuclear weaponry, the Cold War, McCarthyism, the reinforcement of gender roles in which women were situated as wives and mothers because of the post-war baby boom in the suburban domestic sphere, while men were uniformed as corporate entities. So, McCarthyism was a time when there was a paranoia about communism and socialism in the US. And there was a paranoia because writers, there were secret agencies and spies and spying attempts by the FBI and the CIA in which they were spying on Americans. There was a House Un-American Activities Committee, which seemed to look at the work of American writers and American intellectuals with a great deal of suspicion. It was suspected that several writers were secretly sympathetic towards the Soviet Union. And this led to a great deal of paranoia, mistrust, and general state of difficulty. Regarding the gender roles because of the baby boom, the Second World War, and after the end of the Second World War, there was a great deal of stability, which led to a great deal of longevity, safety, security, and improved healthcare and increased longevity, which led to a sudden boom in the population, which is also called as the baby boom. And because of this, a lot of economic development and economic prosperity also came. A lot of cities developed. So a lot of areas which were traditionally not developed, which were rural or semi-rural, became suburbs. New York, San Francisco, Chicago, these cities began to grow, and the outskirts of these cities began to be developed. And so suburban America became a reality. And in this suburban America, the gender roles were very strictly demarcated. Women were expected to raise kids, manage the home, whereas men were expected to go out and earn a living. A literary text which describes this stereotypical demarcation of gender roles very powerfully is the novel Revolutionary Road by the novelist Richard Yates. Now, this was the world which the 1950s created and which people like Robert Lowell lived through in the 1950s. And this was the world which gave rise to the reflections on autobiography, reflections on personal trauma. Robert Lowell suffered through bipolar and manic depression and spells of mania and depression throughout his life. The collection Life Studies gave Lowell an opportunity to let go of a lot of formal restrictions and give voice to his experiences in poetry. The most powerful of these, among the most powerful of these expressions of self is the poem Skunk Hour, which concludes Life Studies, and I will read that poem now. The poem Skunk Hour is dedicated to Elizabeth Bishop, who I have just named, and it was written in response to the poem The Armadillo by Elizabeth Bishop. Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell had a great deal of intellectual exchanges. They wrote many letters to each other, and it was this collaboration inspired a great deal of literary and cultural work. So, the friendship between Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop is the subject of great literary historical interest, and has produced and inspired a great deal of powerful literary writing. So that is the background of the poem Skunk Hour. I will now read the poem. Skunk Hour by Robert Lowell. Nautilus Island's hermit heiress still lives through winter in her Spartan cottage. Her sheep still graze above the sea. Her son's a bishop. Her farmer is first selectman in our village. She's in her dotage. The season's ill. We've lost our summer millionaire, who seemed to leap from an LL Bean catalogue. His 9-knot yawl was auctioned off to lobstermen. A red fox stain covers Blue Hill. And now our fairy decorator brightens his shop for fall, his fishnets filled with orange cork, orange his cobbler's bench and all. There is no money in his work, he'd rather marry. One dark night, my Tudor Ford climbed the hill's skull. I watched for love cars. Lights turned down, they lay together, hull to hull. Where the graveyard shelves on the town, my mind's not right. A car radio bleats, love, oh careless love. I hear my ill spirit sob in each blood cell, as if my hand were at its throat. I myself am hell, nobody's here. I stand on top of our back steps and breathe the rich air. A mother skunk with her column of kittens swills the garbage pail. She jabs her wedge head in a cup of sour cream, drops her ostrich tail, and will not scare. So, what is this poem all about? What does it mean? Let's go over it in some detail. Now, Skunk Hour depicts a man at a moment of great trouble, at a moment of great discomfort. Skunk Hour depicts a man who has been pushed by the combination of his circumstances into a moment of utter helplessness, a moment of what can be described as crisis. Now, in the early 50s, which is to say at the beginning of this decade, which I have been describing, Robert Lowell was a successful, even a famous poet. Yet he was writing a few poems. He was not writing much in the 50s. American culture was changing rapidly and dynamically in those post-war years, as I mentioned, and Lowell, due in part to his encounters with Allen Ginsberg and beat culture, was beginning to feel that his work was archaic and staid. His poems, he worried, were too old-fashioned, too tight-lipped, and taciturn. He felt that he was unable to capture the vivid immediacy of contemporary American life. He once used the expression prehistoric monsters to describe his earlier collections of poems, as if they were dragged down into the bog and death by their ponderous armor. So the question for Lowell was how to write in a way that reflected some of his frustration with the changes that America was undergoing in the 1950s. How could Lowell incorporate a more personal matters into his poetry without violating the privacy of his loved ones and turning his life into mere material? That his life at this particular point in time offered up so much material only exacerbated the sense of crisis. So, while on one hand, Lowell was frustrated at writing about America in an old diction, he was also troubled with how to write about his own life because there was a lot that was happening in his life which seemed to be worthy of poetic expression, which seemed to offer itself to poetic treatment. But he was afraid that this kind of a description, this kind of writing would exploit or extract uh, a literary career out of his personal life, and did not, he felt uncomfortable at wanting to do that. So, what was happening in his life? In a span of about 3 years, Lowell turned 40 and became both an orphan and a parent. This is a very, very powerful and very painful in some ways change, but also it complicates the resources available to the poet to express or deal or reflect on that pain. His mother, with whom he had had a complex and difficult relationship, embodied the double-edged sword, that is liberty and privilege on one hand, social constraint and oppressive propriety on the other. Oppressive propriety because while they were very comfortable, they were also very much in a hierarchical world in which appearances were very important. So the financial comfort came with the discomfort of maintaining uh, proper appearances. So the propriety and the necessity to be proper became an oppressive force. And this was the result of coming from a very high status family in Boston. The expression Boston Brahmin is used to describe this kind of a very elite, very historically very prestigious, financially well off families in Boston. Lowell was one of those and came from one of those and felt very uncomfortable. Lowell had inherited something else from his family too, which was a debilitating manic depression. And the agonizing cycles of this repeatedly institutionalized him during this period. So he was also suffering from bipolar disorder, and due to this, he was frequently institutionalized. Now, Skunk Hour expresses the turmoil of Lowell's personal life at this crucial point. It's a poem framed by matriarchal images and built around an analogy between art and voyeurism. It also dramatizes an inner debate between the demands of formality and discretion on the one hand, and on the other, the longing for an open and candid poetry that would capture the life of a privileged and educated American man in the middle of the 20th century. So, this is very crucial because it helps us understand the many forces, historical, personal, as well as political, which came together and between whose pressures the great literary tradition of 20th century English poetry emerged. The first framing matriarchal image to which we are introduced is the first word, Nautilus Island's hermit heiress. And in this stanza, uh, Lowell uses the pronoun her to denote nearly every noun in the first stanza. The hermit heiress owns everything in her little world. She seems to know no form of relationship other than that of possession. While she may be a stand-in for Lowell's mother, at a deeper level she represents Lowell himself and his fears of what he might become, an isolated, irrelevant creature of the past, ensconced in his social class like an island dweller facing an empty shore. Lowell's language is replete with words indicating aristocratic status, heiress, above, select man, hierarchic, and isolation, which is island, hermit, privacy, and the anachronistic persistence of relics of the past in the vastly changed conditions of the present. Phrases such as Spartan College and Queen Victoria's Century suggest specific historical eras that contrast with the liberalized modernistic present. So historical change is taking place. People are blind people are blind to the fact that times are changing and that they are living or they appear not to have kept up with the times. The poet's choice of images, references, gives readers this important sense. The hermit heiress's venture into real estate, meanwhile, seems to express a deep-seated revulsion towards the present era in favor of the bubble of privilege and hierarchic privacy that she desires to preserve. Lowell's conflict is also evident in other images he presents. Beginning in the third stanza, Lowell introduces a series of images relating to the color red. the season's ill, we've lost our summer millionaire, a red fox stain covers the blue hill, etc. This image is followed later by the blood cell that houses Lowell's sobbing spirit in stanza 6 and the red fire of the skunk's moonstruck eyes in stanza 7. Two of these images are explicitly linked to animals, while the third is connected to Lowell himself, metaphorically reinforcing the ongoing inner conflict between the poet's civilized self and his wilder impulses. In the first four stanzas, the poet's presence is signaled indirectly through possessive phrases such as our village, our summer millionaire, and our fairy decorator. In stanza 5, however, halfway through the poem, he finally makes a direct appearance. One dark night, my Tudor Ford climbed the hill's skull. Right? This is the stanza. Even here, he seems hesitant about fully entering the poem as an active participant. It is not Lowell, after all, but his Tudor Ford, the poem seems to suggest. And the Tudor Ford, Tudor refers to English history many, many years ago, a few centuries earlier, 16th and 17th centuries. The poem is written in the 20th century. Tudor Ford is an anachronistic reference to a bygone era. And the poet seems to suggest that it is not he, Robert Lowell, but rather his Ford car that climbs the hill, almost as if it were acting of its own volition. It's not long before we realize the explanation of Lowell's reluctance to assume responsibility. He's engaged in illicit and voyeuristic activity, which is spying on the love cars. The love cars expression means he's spying on cars in which young lovers, inspired by the era's pop songs, are pursuing their furtive trysts. The link between poetry and voyeurism is the vertebral metaphor of the poem. The poem is about spying, and it's about how spying can lead to poetry, but it's also a poem that describes a young poet's spying with some amount of guilt and shame. Lowell's spying is a metaphor for his art, which, as he was coming to realize, could not be as honest as it needed to be without revealing confidences and risking pain. So that is a very difficult realization for the poet. If he is to work as a successful poet, he must reveal confidences and he must risk pain. Even as he finds himself drawn toward a new, more candid type of poetry, he worries, my mind is not right. He worries in this expression that his desire is a manifestation of a base impulse, perhaps even a consequence of his mental instability. The link between poetry and voyeurism is the vertebral metaphor of the poem. This inner conflict reaches its climax in stanza 6 before giving way to a new set of images. A car radio bleats, love, careless love, I hear my ill spirit sob in each blood cell. And then only skunks, right? Only skunks that search in the moonlight for a bite to eat. They march on their souls up Main Street, white stripes, moonstruck eyes, red fire under the chalk-dry and spar spire of the Trinitarian Church. The skunks are presented as outsiders, rebels, figures of strength who have taken over the sleepy town's main street and whose vivid, almost demonic colors, red, white, moonstruck eyes, appear in sharp contrast to the very dry and very boring chalk-dry and spar spire of the church. The skunks manifest power rather than privilege. They march up Main Street, as would an invading army. Lowell's admiration of the skunks and the potential freedom they represent is what comes through very powerfully in these words. The structure of the poem, we now come to realize, is actually symmetrical. Two stanzas devoted to a matriarchal figure, two to a society in crisis, two to an individual, the poet in crisis, and two to a society led by an alternative matriarchal figure, who represents a potential resolution to Lowell's dilemma. The hermit heiress, who would have had him forego artistic candor and continue to write prehistoric monsters all his life, finds a nemesis in the mother skunk. I stand on top of our back steps and breathe the rich air, a mother skunk with her column of kittens, and so on. What Lowell finds in the mother skunk is an image for the artist he is becoming. It's a rich and deeply ambivalent image. The poet as a garbage pail swiller, rooting about in humanity's trash and finding nourishment there, bringing what is hidden to light. The metaphor seems both mocking and derogatory. There's something ridiculous about the image of the skunk with her nose plunged into the sour cream cup, and also something a bit disgusting. Yet what is most clear is that the skunk is entirely unconcerned with our reaction to her. We are beyond her notice, almost one senses, beneath her contempt. And it is this, perhaps, that injects an element of potential liberation into the scene. Lowell would never give himself over entirely to the path of the skunk. Though he would become known as one of the first and most significant of the so-called confessional poets, his poetry would eschew the uninhibitedness and frequent anti-intellectualism of many of the beats. What feeds his later work is precisely what energizes Skunk Hour, the perpetual, irresolvable tension between the wild and the civilized, between the artist's need to reveal and the human being's need to conceal. So voyeurism is not just something that the poet describes with guilt. Voyeurism is something that the poet realizes is essential to the creation of poetry. The poet needs to be a bit of a voyeur. The poet needs to enjoy being a voyeur on his own life. These are things that are essential to write poetry that speaks to the change, the contradictions, the complexity of the times in which Lowell lived. At times, particularly in his later years, he would ask how well he had balanced these two contradictory tensions, these forces that pull in diametrically opposite directions, which is, on one hand, the artist's need to reveal and the human being's need to conceal. Lowell would wonder whether he had plotted perhaps too freely with my life, not avoiding injury to others, not avoiding injury to myself, to ask compassion. The conflicts that would continue to shape the remainder of Lowell's artistic career, and to a great extent his personal life as well, are all present microcosmically in the deeply illuminating self-portrait that Skunk Hour ultimately reveals itself to be. With this, we have come to an end of the discussion of this poem and also our discussion of Robert Lowell, a poet who signifies many of the tensions, many of the complexities that 20th century America was living through, a poet who innovates and pioneers in the writing of Anglophone American poetry, a poet who would end up having a great and lasting impact on how poets would view their vocations, how poets would write, how poets would view their relation to life and writing. And we have seen how this poem, Skunk Hour, which is the last poem of the collection Life Studies, which is in fact published in the last year of the decade, the sixth decade, also responds to many of the contradictions, many of the frustrations that intellectuals and writers had begun to feel in 1950s America. We will now move on to other poets, and we will also later in this course encounter the work of two poets who innovate and who pick up the baton from Robert Lowell, as it were. These two poets are Elizabeth Bishop and Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath will explicitly refer to Life Studies as a volume that inspires her very powerfully, and who will in fact go much further than Lowell ever could in her own reflection on her own family, her own personal life, and the difficulty that she faced while reconciling herself to the memories of her father after he passed away. Thank you. With this, we come to the end of this lecture. I look forward to engaging 20th century poetry in the next lecture. Thank you.